Have you been waiting long, David?
A little while.
Good evening from Buckingham Palace, where the nation and the world is preparing to say goodbye to Elizabeth II.
The state funeral will be the biggest international event ever held in the UK, attended by prime ministers and presidents, princes and kings.
Hello and good evening from Buckingham Palace, where right now a reception is just ending for more than 500 foreign dignitaries who will attend tomorrow's state funeral. The list includes President Biden of the United States, Emperor Naruhito of Japan and Elena Zelenska, the wife of the Ukrainian president. But this week has been about all of us, people of all ages, backgrounds and places who have joined that most British of institutions, a queue, wanting to be part of something historic. And tonight at 8 p.m, the nation will stop for a minute's silence to honour the Queen. Well, for now, they are still coming in their thousands. Some waited in line for more than 24 hours to pay their respects. At one point, the queue stretched back for nearly 5 miles, a pilgrimage sustained by flasks of tea, sausage rolls and warm words with new friends. This is the last full day of lying in state. Members of the public will be allowed to file past the coffin until 6:30 tomorrow morning. We are on the eve of the first state funeral in more than half a century. It will offer a sense of history and continuity, involving traditions and rites that have evolved over generations.
The funeral of Queen Elizabeth II will be held at Westminster Abbey, the resting place of monarchs and the traditional site of state funerals for centuries. Ahead of the service, a funeral procession will escort the Queen's coffin to the Abbey from the Houses of Parliament, where it's been lying in state. The coffin, draped with the Royal Standard, will be borne on the state gun carriage of the Royal Navy. The Royal Marines will lead the procession around Parliament Square. Behind, senior members of the royal family, including her children and the King, will be accompanied on the journey to the Abbey by the sound of massed pipes and muffled drums. The procession will enter the Great West Door of Westminster Abbey at exactly 11 o'clock, marking the start of the funeral service. The Queen will be carried past the grave of the unknown warrior and down the nave of the Abbey. Following, as they pass under the ornate gilded entrance of the choir, will be the Archbishop of Canterbury and other senior clergy. And then the coffin, followed by the King and senior members of the royal family, will be taken to the very heart of the Abbey and placed in front of the high altar. Members of the royal family will be seated alongside. Behind them, in the south transept, heads of state, leaders and royalty from around the world. Sitting opposite, holders of the Victoria and George Crosses, their counterparts from the Commonwealth and members of the nation's highest orders of chivalry. While the Prime Minister, former Prime Ministers and the leaders of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland will sit in the Abbey's choir stalls. The Dean of Westminster will lead the service. Lessons will be read by the Prime Minister and the Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, and the sermon will be given by the Archbishop of Canterbury. At the end of the service, the last post will be sounded from the Gothic splendour of the Lady Chapel, resting place of kings and queens, including Elizabeth I, going back 700 years. A 2-minute silence will be observed throughout the United Kingdom before the Reveille is sounded by trumpeters of the Household Cavalry, and in the Abbey, the national anthem is sung. The final act in the service will be a procession of the Queen's coffin back through the choir and along the nave, out of the Abbey and back onto the state gun carriage before it's taken to Windsor and her final resting place.
Well, I'm joined now by Sky's Royal commentator Alistair Bruce and Rear Admiral Jude Terry from the Royal Navy. Welcome to both of you. Tomorrow will be, just such an extraordinary event, Alistair, with so much grief attached to it for so many people. Just take us through what we can expect.
Well, it's the last time we can wrap Elizabeth II with the splendour of the nation. And in 3 parts, she'll be taken to her grave, starting with the state funeral at Westminster Abbey, which has just been explained. And then she will be conveyed to Windsor Castle for the Committal, when she will be placed in the royal vault. And then last thing in the evening, there will be the interment of the Queen, Prince Philip, with King George VI and the late Queen Elizabeth. And I think what's so special about all of that is that at the heart of tomorrow is a simple Christian soul who had great faith being conveyed out of the splendour of the crown she wore into the humility of a Christian soul ascending to heaven.
And Rear Admiral, the military have been absolutely central throughout, have they not? And another big role for them tomorrow.
Yes, tomorrow we have the privilege of our last duty to Her Majesty the Queen, demonstrating our thanks to her for her dedication and service to us and for everything she did for us, and also allow us our opportunity to demonstrate to His Majesty the King our support and our gratefulness for his support as we go through the rest of our careers. We have about 3,000 people will be on parade in London tomorrow, and about 1,000 people in Windsor. Those are made up of the Army, the Navy and the Air Force, but also Commonwealth nations will be represented. And we have approximately 175 Commonwealth nations being represented tomorrow. The Navy has a key part to play with the state gun carriage, obviously, but the key thing for all of us is that we've worked as a team, delivering what His Majesty wants to see tomorrow and what the nation wants. And it's been incredible as the person in charge for the Royal Navy to be able to watch young sailors, Royal Marines, people from the RFA, Royal Fleet Auxiliary join as under my training team, and then to watch them, you'll have seen the rehearsals, to have watched them working with their colleagues from across the world and across the other services.
Well, it is the Royal Navy, is it not, that pulls this state gun carriage. It's a really critical moment. What's the history of that then, Alistair?
Well, when Queen Victoria died in 1901, her train was so late arriving at Windsor that the horses that were due to take the gun carriage up the hill got cold and kicked their traces and had to be taken off the gun carriage. The King was distraught, and his niece's husband, who was an admiral like the fine lady here, was Prince Louis of Battenberg, and he suggested that the naval route liners take the ropes that were holding the crowd back and attach it to the gun carriage and take Queen Victoria to St George's Chapel, Windsor. And he was so grateful that he said, forevermore, it will be a privilege for the Royal Navy to carry their sovereign to her final resting place.
We will certainly see that tomorrow, won't we? Stay there, both of you, because earlier this afternoon, President Biden also made that visit to see Her Majesty's coffin. Let's get the very latest now from Dominic Waghorn, who joins us. The lying in state, just one part of a busy schedule, certainly, for the President. And he's one of more than 500 foreign dignitaries who've been in Buckingham Palace. And we can see the outriders beginning to take those people away, Dominic.
Yeah, I think that event is now over. Another extraordinary event in at least a week of them. 500 foreign dignitaries, and it's hard to remember a time when that number of world leaders, prime ministers, royalty gathered in one place, in one city, if it's ever happened before or if it will ever happen again. And that followed these extraordinary scenes we saw earlier in Westminster Hall here, where we saw presidents, royalty, kings and queens join ordinary people who had queued up. The VIPs got fast-track access, but they joined also to pay their respects, their last respects to the Queen as she lay in state here. And of course, those world leaders are here for the funeral tomorrow. And what's interesting about this is, of course, the huge logistical challenge that has faced officials here. What do you do with that number of world leaders? 100 heads of government, amongst them 20 royal figures and 500 foreign dignitaries. How do you get them from wherever they are in London to Westminster Abbey, and what do you do with them afterwards? This is my report on this great convergence of royalty and dignitaries currently gathering in London.
As the people have continued to file through Westminster Hall, behind them a steady stream of foreign dignitaries. The kings of Spain and Sweden. The First Lady of Ukraine, clearly moved, and presidents from around the world. US President Joe Biden joining mourners to pay his respects.
She was the same in person as her image. Decent, honorable, and all about service. It's a loss that leaves a giant hole. And sometimes you think you'll never overcome it. But as I've told the King, she's going to be with him every step of the way, every minute, every moment. And that's a reassuring notion.
One of 100 heads of governments gathering here. From emperors to crown princes, there are 20 royals among 500 foreign guests.
Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda.
They know this will never be repeated because a unique era is drawing to a close. Another beginning, not least for the Commonwealth, whose leaders met King Charles earlier today. On the eve of the funeral, a prediction from the President of Trinidad and Tobago that under the new king, more and more Commonwealth countries will give up the monarch as head of state, as the times continue changing.
There is a feeling now, after all these years, that the sovereign should really be the people. And that to have a sovereign from a country that is far removed, not only geographically, but culturally, right, might not necessarily be the best thing at this time of the nation's development. So I think that perhaps the process will begin speeding up in various territories.
What would be your emotions? What will be going through your mind as you sit in the Abbey tomorrow looking back on the era?
I thought, well, I really would have to carry my handkerchief with me because it's quite possible that I may shed a tear for the Queen.
At this funeral, death will be the great leveller. Whatever the rank, dignitaries all arriving in coach class, bussed in from Chelsea's Royal Hospital. Being corralled in a glorified holding pen and then put on buses is not what world leaders are used to, but it is the only option, say officials, who've never had to deal with so many foreign dignitaries all at the same time. Noses are already out of joint. Resentment reportedly that the US president will be an exception, able to attend in Cadillac 1. It is a diplomatic minefield. But as leaders and dignitaries filed into Buckingham Palace this evening, a sense of the enormity of this occasion. The world's most influential and powerful people gathering together to pay a final tribute to a monarch loved like no other. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News, Westminster.
Well, I'm joined now by Lord Boateng, who was the UK's first black cabinet minister and a former British High Commissioner to South Africa. Welcome to you. We're about to see all those dignitaries depart, are we not? The buses are lined up for them. They're on buses, extraordinary, really, stuff. But, you know, reflect on the meeting in there, the importance of this now for King Charles and, you know, why everybody's decided to come.
I think, first of all, this is an indication of just how much Her late Majesty meant to the world, but to the world's leadership too. She was a great convener. She brought people together. She embodied the nation, and yet she transcended politics. So whatever a country's relationship with the British government, they tended to have a positive relationship with the monarch. And one saw that for events like our National Day out in the field in British posts all over the world. It is the Queen's birthday. And so people came to our National Day in greater numbers than to any other, because in coming to our event, they were celebrating something very personal to the Queen, and she meant something to them. So a great convener, and this is a testament to her success over so many years.
What does this mean for Britain right now? Can we read anything into it, or is this simply about our monarch?
I think it's about transition, and I don't think we should be frightened of transition. King Charles has been around on the international scene as someone with great concerns around climate, around the environment, around human rights. He is well known. And so it's not as if they were meeting a stranger, but he is of a different generation. So this is a moment of transition, but it's not a moment of danger. It's a time in which we are entitled to celebrate all the Queen gave to the nation and to the world, but to look forward to a developing and evolving relationship where King Charles will embody this nation, its values, and what it represents in the modern world.
The Commonwealth, which was tiny when she was coronated and now is big, is a central part of the people who are there. What are your hopes for the Commonwealth as it goes forward, and the role of the monarch, too, in that?
I think it's important to remember that the Queen is, to a very large extent, the originator of the Commonwealth ideal. It grew during her reign. She propelled that growth. She kept it together at moments of peril, and there have been moments of peril, particularly around South Africa and apartheid, and the British government's role in that regard. And yet it was the Queen, with her support for the Commonwealth, with her sense of its non-racial, multi-ethnic nature, the relationship she developed with Nelson Mandela, it was the Queen who kept that together. But at the same time, the Commonwealth freely decided to make King Charles her successor. This wasn't something that was forced on them. It was done out of recognition, not just of the Queen's personal wish, but also of King Charles's fitness for that purpose, as someone who'd taken a deep and abiding interest in the Commonwealth and also on those issues that affect it. And what are those issues? The environment, undoubtedly, climate change. He has played an enormously important role in that regard. Also, and importantly, values around inclusivity and diversity. You know, King Charles was at the forefront in terms of celebrating diversity and addressing issues of disadvantage before it became fashionable. And I think the wider world recognises that.
Lord Boateng, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. We'll certainly keep an eye on those dignitaries. So many of them that have been in Buckingham Palace this evening. But right now, let's head to Dermot Monaghan at Windsor.
Anna, many thanks. Well, this afternoon, Prince Andrew paid tribute to Her Majesty the Queen, calling her mummy and saying, "I will forever hold you close to my heart." Then on Friday, he was seen again in military uniform as he stood vigil with his siblings over the Queen's coffin at Westminster Hall. Well, I'm joined now by our royal correspondent, Laura Bundock. And Laura, what else did he say in his statement?
It's a really interesting statement for a number of reasons. He is the last of the Queen's children to make a statement and the only one to use the word mummy in that statement, which is in itself interesting. I think if you look at the photo he released in accompanying this statement, it is the most intimate of images. You can see in 1960, in March 1960, the Queen cradling him closely, taken by the society photographer Cecil Beaton. And what an intimate image, perhaps the most intimate photo we have seen from all the photos that the family have been releasing. It was often reported how close close he was to the Queen, and certainly this photo does suggest this cherished, deep affection. And the words too, I'll just talk you through a little chunk of this statement. He says, "Mummy, your love for a son, your compassion, your care, your confidence, I will treasure forever. I have found your knowledge and wisdom infinite, with no boundary or containment. I will miss your insights, advice and humour." And he adds, "As our book of experiences closes, another opens, and I will forever hold you close to my heart with my deepest love and gratitude, and I will tread gladly into the next with you as my guide." And again, a very personal tribute there, a real sense of his loss, of how bereft he's feeling at the moment. But don't forget, Prince Andrew had to step down from all royal roles and duties back in 2019. The Queen stripped him of all his honorary military titles, and he was only allowed to wear a uniform at the vigil as a special sort of occasion, as a special event. It was all kind of in... If we remember back to the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, his involvement in that is what brought it about. Earlier this year, he settled the case with Virginia Giuffre out of court. Don't know how much, an undisclosed sum, meant to be a very, very big sum, though. What does this statement say? It shows how bereft he is, perhaps his attempt of rehabilitating himself back into the royal family. What role there might be for him, what duties might lie ahead, is very, very unclear at the moment, if any at all.
Laura, many thanks. Laura Bundock, our royal correspondent. Well, of course, the Queen will be buried here at Windsor Castle in St George's Chapel, alongside her husband and her parents, George VI and Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. After the end of the funeral service, outside Westminster Abbey's Great West Door, the Queen's coffin will be mounted on the state gun carriage of the Royal Navy. A huge procession involving members of the royal family will travel down Whitehall. Hundreds of representatives of armed forces from across the services and Commonwealth realms will march across Horse Guards and onto the Mall. The Queen will then be drawn past Buckingham Palace for one final time, before the procession, armed forces lining the route, arrives at Wellington Arch. There, by Hyde Park Corner, the coffin will be transferred to the state hearse, and the funeral cortege will leave for Windsor. It will travel through West London, beyond the limits of the capital, and past Heathrow Airport, before arriving at Windsor Castle. There, a new procession will begin at the Long Walk and move into the castle. The hearse, scores of soldiers, courtiers and the royal family will process to the steps of St George's Chapel, the very church where the Queen said goodbye to her husband, Prince Philip. Inside, the royal family, foreign royalty, the Prime Minister, realm Prime Ministers and Knights of the Garter will gather for a committal service led by the Dean of Windsor. In the historic chapel choir at the end of the service, the Queen's most senior advisor, the Lord Chamberlain, will ceremonially break his wand of office and place it on the coffin. And then, one last act. The national anthem will be sung, God Save the King, marking the final moment of her nation's farewell to Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. Well, I'm joined now by the author and contemporary historian Sir Anthony Selden. And Sir Anthony, so then Windsor Castle, St George's Chapel, will be the Queen's final resting place, as it is for so many other members of her family.
Indeed, some 25 members of the royal family are buried there, including 10 monarchs, incredibly. And it's now the regular final resting place of the monarch in this extraordinary castle here, which is the longest continuously inhabited royal residence, going back to 1066, and chosen because of the river. The story is all about the River Thames, the royal family story, coming all the way, wending all the way up to London. Here, chosen because it was the defensive point, defending London from attack from the west, and then extended in 1100. And since 1100, all monarchs have at different times been here. Charles I imprisoned here, but also buried here in 1649 after he was executed in Whitehall Palace. So full of history, history of the royal family, and extraordinarily special. And for the last 10 years of her life, this is where Queen Elizabeth II lived.
But interestingly, given how much she favoured Windsor Castle, Queen Victoria is not buried in the chapel, but in Frogmore Mausoleum.
That was Victoria all over. Victoria always did things her own way. When her husband died, she went into retreat. When Queen Elizabeth II's husband died, she was straight back on her duty. Queen Victoria lying in state in her beloved Osborne House in the Isle of Wight, and the Queen Elizabeth II doing things in a much more expected way.
I want to talk more about, of course, Her Majesty the Queen's life in a moment or two, but let's listen to the Queen's first public speech. That was back in 1940 as a teenager, a radio address to the children of the Commonwealth, many of them living away from home, of course, because of the war. And then to one of her last appearances on television. I think you know what it is, earlier this year during the Platinum Jubilee.
Thousands of you in this country have had to leave your homes and be separated from your fathers and mothers. My sister Margaret Rose and I feel so much for you, as we know from experience what it means to be away from those we love most of all. To you living in new surroundings, we send a message of true sympathy, and at the same time we would like to thank the kind people who have welcomed you to their homes in the country.
Never mind.
Oh dear. Perhaps you would like a marmalade sandwich? I always keep one for emergencies.
So do I. I keep mine in here.
Oh.
For later.
Here we go.
And Sir Anthony Selden is still with me. Sir Anthony, what's interesting there, I think what strikes most people in terms of the two clips we've used, obviously the amount of time between them, but the change in the Queen's voice, and that tells us something, doesn't it? Received pronunciation back in 1940, those clipped tones, and much more like the rest of us speak by the time of Paddington, if I can put it that way.
Well, it shows her extraordinary power of adaptation, doesn't it? She moved with the times, and that's why she remained enduringly loved and popular. But also, I haven't seen that 1941 before. There, you could see her ability to empathise. Even as a 14, 15-year-old, she was saying that she could imagine what young people felt being away from their families. And she felt it. You can feel there is a thoroughly authentic person, even though she's barely a teenager. And then you fast forward some 80 years to the Platinum Jubilee, and there she's still got that ability to be funny and empathetic and communicate with people, with children and people of all ages. I mean, that's a sublime gift in anybody, but to have that gift as a monarch, wow, I mean, that's really special.
And just looking back to the 1940s, and there's Her Majesty the Queen, of course, in service. And Sir Anthony, is this, in a way, then, the final end of the post-war period with the death of Her Majesty the Queen, that link now broken?
I think it is. I really do. And it was significant that in one of her greatest ever broadcasts during COVID, and who, of course, did the nation look to during COVID for consolation and direction? They looked to the monarch, not to the Prime Minister. They looked to the monarch. What was her cultural reference point? Back to Vera Lynn, back to We'll Meet Again. So I think that is a closing down of the Second World War. In a way, the long Second World War and Britain's role as one of the great powers in the Second World War and the Empire, it's all coming to an end now. Brexit also another factor in that. we are at the dawn of a new age, and we have to find a new place in the world and a new justification for Britain claiming its authority in the world.
So, Anthony, do stay with us, but for the time being, thank you very much indeed. Well, of course, in the past 10 days, the King has moved from Edinburgh to Belfast and Cardiff and then back to London, greeting his new subjects. He's been met with warmth and affection, but once that wave of grief and emotion has passed, so might some of the goodwill towards the new monarch. Our royal correspondent, Rhiannon Mills, reports.
God save the King.
God save the King. The change was immediate. For a man who always knew this time would come, the cameras allowed in like never before, so we could understand how he felt about her and what he's taken on.
As the Queen herself did with such unswerving devotion, I too now solemnly pledge myself, throughout the remaining time God grants me, to uphold the constitutional principles at the heart of our nation.
Scott Fessenden-Wood, the British High Commissioner to Barbados, was Charles's Deputy Private Secretary for 4 years and believes the man he knows well has acted quickly to squash suggestions he'll be a meddling monarch.
As king, he will do things differently. It's a very different job. But I think we'll still see those same instincts, that same desire to want to use his role appropriately, but to use his role in a way which makes a difference to this country, makes a difference in the Commonwealth, and does a service.
I, Charles, Prince of Wales.
There are no rules for how he should reign, but he had the best of teachers. The Queen guiding him towards the role that would eventually be his. It shaped a man who always keeps his police officers on their toes, the walkabouts this week coming naturally. As he showed us, he wasn't just going to do what was expected, but what matters to him.
The sovereign has an additional duty, less formally recognised, but to be no less diligently discharged. It is the duty to protect the diversity of our country.
On the world stage, she will be a hard act to follow, very rarely putting a foot wrong.
Oh God, I hate this.
The rolling cameras haven't always been as forgiving for her son, inkwells and pens bearing the brunt, and in some ways showing why the new king and the institution still has work to do.
While we struggle to heat our homes, we have to pay for your parade.
And why the new monarch has needed his family.
Getting the right tone in this moment was always going to be potentially difficult for King Charles. But what we have seen this week is how the entire family also want to step up to help. In every one of their tributes to the Queen, they also mention their brother, their father, their uncle, and their support for the new king.
Publicly, he has united them, but it is still the Queen that has brought the world together. Now that heaviest of responsibilities rests with her son, finally it is his time to lead. Rhiannon Mills, Sky News, in central London.
And Sir Anthony Selden is still with me. Well, Sir Anthony has been oft observed over the past 10 days. We're in a new era. How will Charles approach the role?
Well, he's shown already that he is fully up for it. He's had the longest induction of anybody on earth, 70 years waiting for it. He's got lots of ideas, but he's also very clear that he's not going to enter the political arena. In one sense, he doesn't need to, because we all know what he thinks about the environment and about local crafts and arts and communities, so he doesn't need to, but he clearly wants to carry on that heritage, to the monarchy to still represent the entire United Kingdom. That's going to be a big struggle for him with Ireland, with Scotland, keeping the Commonwealth together. But I think he's made a really good start. I mean, it's such a tough act taking over from his mother. You never want to take over as a leader from somebody who is much loved, who everyone thinks is great, because how can you compare? And when she started off, she was young and beautiful. We felt protective towards her. You know, there he is, a 73-year-old, but I think he's done well.
Sir Anthony, for the time being, thank you very much indeed. Well, from Windsor Castle, now back to Buckingham Palace and Anna.
I'll miss her hugely, the heartfelt words from the Archbishop of Canterbury as he prepares for his role at the Queen's state funeral. Justin Welby also told me that world leaders should learn from Queen Elizabeth's example. He will give the sermon in Westminster Abbey tomorrow in front of a global audience, which could reach billions.
I feel very privileged to be there. Not pleased to be there, because we would all prefer that this had not happened, but we're all going to miss and grieve for the Queen, but it's a huge privilege to be able to take part in this, focused on the family first, because this is a family saying goodbye at a funeral to someone they loved.
Do you get a sense of national mourning? I know you've been down to see the crowds queuing it outside Westminster Hall, for example. You know, is there a shared experience we're having here?
Oh, yes. Yes. I think it is a genuinely shared experience. It's an experience of grief, for many deep grief, but also mixed with an experience of immense thankfulness. Talking to people yesterday in the queue and earlier in the week, listening to them, they said, I'd say, why have you come? I wanted to say thank you. And I found that deeply moving.
He was the longest serving Prince of Wales this country has ever seen. Is it too much, do you think, to expect somebody to take on this role in their later years?
No. He is a man of very great intelligence, humility, thoughtfulness, commitment to service, and he's been thinking about this role for very, very many years indeed. A few days ago on Wednesday at the receiving at Westminster Hall, there was an almost tangible sense of the roles, the weight of the roles settling on him, and him rising to gather that and hold it as the Queen did.
Such extraordinary tributes about Her Majesty. Her thoughtfulness and her kindness have really stood out to the people I've spoken to, and you've had that experience yourself, haven't you, from her?
Yes, very much so. The thing that, there's been all kinds of things, but her capacity to put one at one's ease. I remember being at a meal she asks a bishop in January every year to go each Sunday to Sandringham. She used to do this and preach. Saturday evening, quite often, they go for a barbecue in January in North Norfolk in the woods, in a cabin in the woods. And she has loads of house guests. And one of them, it's very relaxed. And there's no electricity, and you all lay the table, she lays the table, everyone lays the table. And I was there feeling I'm going to wake up in a minute. You know, this can't be real. And one of the house guests said to me, Archbishop, could you just put the candlesticks on the table and light the candles? Something from my school days just rang a bell. And I went over to her and said, ma'am, would it be helpful if I put the candlesticks on the table and lit the candles? And there was a little twinkle in her eye because she knew what was going on. And she said, no, I don't think Prince Philip would like that at all. And they were just trying to get me into trouble. But it was so funny. She was so relaxed and fun and just a very, very lovely human being.
Many people did say that her "we'll meet again" message during COVID got them through the pandemic. Do you get the sense at all that she's just leaving us at just the wrong moment as we head into this difficult winter, which many people are frightened about?
I think people are very frightened about the future. And for many, we mustn't forget, we've had 10 days of mourning, but we got the funeral tomorrow. Official national mourning ends, I think, day after tomorrow. But that hasn't brought more money into people's pockets. People are still going to food banks during this time. struggling to work out how to make the budget last, make the pay last as long as the month, or the benefit last as long as the month. And people are frightened. But I am absolutely, the extraordinary thing about the royal family is that they know that, and they are deeply aware of it. And yes, there's going to be changes, and the next few months may be very difficult. Many people will be. But from the point of view of the head of state, there's been a seamless transition. There's not going to be a gap there. There will be the hardship, but there's not going to be the gap.
When was the last time you saw her?
It was end of June, early July. I can't quite remember the exact date, and I went along with something to give her, actually, a cross of nails like this. These nails are a symbol of the cathedral. They fell from the roof of the medieval cathedral as it burned in the Great Blitz. It's been used as a symbol of reconciliation and peace building around the world. And she's had such an influence on peacemaking and peace building and drawing people together that we gave her that gift, and I was privileged to give it to her. I came back and I said to my wife, oh, we needn't worry. I'm not going to have to do a coronation. It'll be my successor who does that. She's so fit. And her memory was so acute, her observation so perceptive. You got the benefit of 70 years of accumulated wisdom in government and in leadership. And, not only her family, but I think every senior politician, every Archbishop will miss her.
You sound like you will, I have to say.
Hugely.
You talked about the work the Queen did in peace and conciliation, quite frankly, and we will watch all these people arriving from around the world on Monday. And there is a sense, even now, that she's unifying the globe in this, don't you think?
Yes. Her conciliation and peace building was not the sort of hands-on way of doing it. It was inspirational and symbolic that made people look at things a bit differently, especially within the Commonwealth, and work behind the scenes, as we know now from the time of the apartheid regime in South Africa, and being very conscious of the symbolic importance of what the British government did at that time, for example. But she's going to unite more global leaders, possibly than at any point in human history. I hope and pray that they will reflect on their own leadership and think, do I want my legacy to be in the bank balance of earth, or in the words of Jesus, who she followed so faithfully, do I want to store up treasure in heaven? And which she has done in her way of service.
Are you saying that they could learn from her?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there are extraordinary, wonderful leaders coming. I hope they find what they hear and see and think about, a moment where they say to themselves, I would really like people to look on me in the way that they look on her.
We know that she'll be buried alongside her late husband. She'll be reunited with her family, her father, her mother, her sister. They're a tight-knit family. Did she really believe that she would see them again?
Yes.
How did she express that to you?
Not only to me, but in that great COVID broadcast, but in her Christmas broadcasts as well. She was a deeply faithful and faith-filled, undemonstrative, quiet Christian who trusted in the faithfulness of God, in the words we often use, that she would and her family rest in peace and rise in glory. It's at the heart of Christian faith.
Is she at peace now?
Yes.
And should the nation take comfort from that?
I think the nation should take hope from that. Not just comfort, but hope for themselves. It's a gift that she knew that came from God, in whom she believed and trusted, in whom she served, and who gave her the strength to be what she was.
The Archbishop of Canterbury there speaking to me, and as you can see, the lying in state continues inside Westminster Hall. The French President Emmanuel Macron and his wife Brigitte, as you can see, the latest world leaders to pay their respects. Members of the public still being allowed in. People had earlier been asked not to join the queue, which is at Tower Bridge now, but a decision on ending that queue has not yet been taken. A little under 11 hours left now of lying in state, and the people still queuing, as you can see, Victoria Gardens there at Westminster. Well, let's bring in now Sky's Royal commentator Alistair Bruce and Rear Admiral Jude Terry from the Royal Navy. Joining me also here, Nancy O'Neill, who is one of those who's been invited, in fact, to the service tomorrow. Alistair, first of all, let's talk about the Archbishop of Canterbury. He plays a central role in a number of ways tomorrow. Talking there about how Her Majesty was deeply faithful and faith-filled and firmly believed that she would be reunited with her husband.
Well, he had a very close relationship with the Queen, and I think because the Queen was supreme governor of the Church of England and he was head, really, of the Anglican Communion across the world, it's a very interesting time, I think, for him to now encompass faith for the nation. And I think in your talk with him, particularly in your question about the Queen being at peace, he took that exactly as one would most want somebody in his position to do. I think for the Queen, it always seemed that faith was so special to her because in almost every part of her life, she was elevated above the rest. But I think for her own peace of mind, the place where she felt just like us all was before God. And I think that made it easier for her to endure such a long period of being number one. Because I think that particularly in the way she found reassurance, and I think she took this from her parents too, in the faithfulness that she had, which the Archbishop discussed. I think that was a great guide to her. And the Archbishop, I am sure, amongst many others in the Church, and other faith leaders that the Queen has met, were able to reassure the Queen in that process. And if you believe, as Christians do, in eternal life, then the Archbishop's quite right to say this is, in its own way, a rejoicing time for her soul.
We know also she loved the detail of the military, didn't she? She felt a real closeness to them, not least because of her family members who had served, and there were very many of them. And what was her relationship specifically with the Royal Navy, which is the force that you obviously are a member of?
So obviously the Queen was the first female to serve in the armed forces when she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Squadron. So she had a really close relationship with the military. She was a Colonel-in-Chief of over 50 regiments, organisations, ships, etc. So she had a really close relationship. From our perspective, she was the daughter of a sailor, she was the wife of a sailor, she was the mother of sailors, and she also, Prince William also served some time in the Royal Navy, and therefore she understood it from that perspective. She was hugely supportive of everything we did, and from our perspective, the ships, Queen Elizabeth, Lancaster, her ships that she sponsored, she was always really interested not only in what they were doing on operations, which was incredible, but also the families of the people who were on those ships. And every year in her Christmas message, she would reflect on all of the armed forces, where they were serving on operations around the world, and be incredibly grateful for us, as well as our nursing colleagues and those in the emergency services who would have to work over those holidays. So from our perspective, she was one of us. She lived as a naval wife in her early marriage to Prince Philip in Malta, and declared that was one of her happiest times of how she lived, and was able to bestow on Prince Philip in 2011 the honour of being the Lord High Admiral, which she was incredibly proud to do to him, to honour his service as well and his affinity with the service. But tomorrow is all about all three services working together as one team to deliver it for Her Majesty.
The New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said she had grown up never knowing anything other than the Queen, saying there was nothing ever that suggested to me that I couldn't be a woman in leadership, watching on from Her Majesty. Here you are now, the first woman to hold flag rank of the Royal Navy. I'm not suggesting it's going to be the same for you, but, is she a role model for all of us?
She's an incredible role model for all of us, and actually, no matter what your gender, obviously from being a female, she was incredibly inspirational, as is her daughter, as are other members of her family. I've been privileged enough to meet the Queen twice, absolutely incredible. But also, just in terms of allowing everybody to be the best they could be, she encouraged everybody, no matter where they were from, no matter what regiment they were in, no matter what rank they were in, no matter whether they wore an RAF uniform, a Navy uniform or Army. So absolutely, and a real role model for leadership, for compassion, for dedication, and we could all do well to learn from that.
And I know there's a real pride for all of those taking part in Monday's event, certainly. Well, let's bring in now Nancy O'Neill, a nurse from Bradford and one of 183 special honours recipients who's been invited to attend tomorrow's state funeral at Westminster Abbey. First of all, how are you feeling about that? A little overwhelmed, perhaps?
Yes. Definitely overwhelmed's one of the words. It's still very surreal. I don't think it'll feel real until I'm actually there. And well, probably until after I've come out and reflected upon it, because it does feel very much as if this is something that's happening to somebody else. But I was just reflecting earlier. I got off the train from Leeds this afternoon, stood on Victoria Tube platform, and the man that stood next to me was one of the 183 as well. And I recognised him because there'd been an article in the newspaper that he and I were the subject of that article, and there was a picture of him. And I thought, shall I ask him? So I asked him, and he said, yes, and I recognise you too. So, yeah.
Amazing. So what did you think when you first got the invitation? And the point is that you're a birthday honours recipient of the summer, are you not?
That's right, yeah. And because we haven't been to the investiture yet, so we haven't received our award in person. And that's what the man from the Cabinet Office said, that because we hadn't received it yet, we were going to invite a number of people. He didn't say how many. We didn't know it was 183 at that time. So he said that would I be interested in attending? And when I stopped saying, wow, really? Are you sure? I said, yes, absolutely, I'd be interested in attending. So that was that. But there were three thoughts went through my head. The first one was, oh, maybe because the Queen has now died, the King doesn't want us to have the award. Maybe he can change his mind. The second one was, what an odd time to ring me to tell me the date for going to collect my award. I thought they were a little bit busy. And the third one was, is this a hoax? Is this somebody I know that's making this up and that? So, and he just said, well, somebody will be in touch shortly from the royal household. And then 4 or 5 days went by and nothing came, and I thought, increasingly, this is a hoax. But then it wasn't. So here I am.
And it was your sterling work as a nurse for 41 years, plus your sterling work during the pandemic, trying to get key workers and NHS staff tested, one of the first test centres up and running. And we know that the Queen felt very grateful to all of those who'd worked during the pandemic. She told us in that We'll Meet Again, tape that I mentioned with the Archbishop. So do you feel, grateful to her that she recognised the hard work you were all doing?
Absolutely. It's not just the recognition that she gave then either. I think it's, that came to the fore, and that speech was quite important to people that were working, not just in the health service, but in health and social care, because they were working incredibly hard as well. But I think, she was a clear advocate previously of the NHS, and she, supported and encouraged people to follow the rules and to do the right thing, and we were working very hard in the background, and yes, I worked in Bradford District and Craven delivering the COVID, some of the COVID response, but it was the people that are unseen and unheard that delivered that service, down to the cleaners and the volunteers that were marshalling. There were all sorts of people. I was fortunate in that, obviously, I was recognised for that, but it's on behalf of other people.
Nancy, I hope you get to sit next to the other 183, the man you met on the train. Thank you both, all of you. Thank you very much indeed. Let's head now to Dermot ahead of that minute's silence at 8 p.m.
Anna, thank you very much indeed. Well, as Anna was just saying, at 8 o'clock precisely, a minute's silence will be observed around the country to remember Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Sir Anthony Selden, the historian, is with me now. And Sir Anthony, just explain to us, what is the origin of a national moment of silence?
The First World War was so vast in world experience, over 20 million dead, that when it was happening, people were wondering, how can we possibly mark this? And to find something that transcends national difference and language difference. With silence, everyone can understand. You don't need language, you don't need nationality to understand that it's a moment where everyone can come together and be silent and in reverence of the enormous number of dead, compounded by those who died from the Spanish flu, some 50 million who died in 1918, 1919, 1920. So in 1919, on the 11th of November, by the Cenotaph, there was the first 2-minute silence, and that took a hold. People liked it, and still more so after the Second World War. It embedded it further. It's a moment where the nation comes together to commemorate those who have died, but also, as now, when there's a great figure, a truly extraordinary figure who touched the hearts of everybody.
And Sir Anthony, it is both a collective act, but also an individual one, where the individual reflects as well as part of that collective.
Yes, I mean, nobody knows exactly, it's so private, what people are thinking about and reflecting about. But those who have, as many had with COVID, lost dear ones, loved ones. Since the Queen died, 17,000 people have died in this country, often much younger than the Queen. So there's been a lot of personal grief going on just in the few days since she died. It's a moment, a time for us to get in touch with our deepest selves and to find an inner resolution, an inner acceptance to be at one with ourselves, as well as being at one with everybody else.
A form of meditation, almost.
Well, I've practiced meditation all my life, or most of it, and have drawn great strength from that inner sense of stillness and just collecting yourself, coming to yourself. It helps you to really make the most of your life, as this will do.
Well, welcome to those channels who have just joined us here on Sky News. We are about to observe a national moment of reflection to mourn the death of the late Queen Elizabeth II and reflect, of course, on her life and legacy. It's a minute's silence that will be observed up and down the country. These some of the locations, obviously in central London, where people will pause, reflect, and stay silent for just a minute after we hear the chimes from the clock tower of Big Ben. Clearly those people, those thousands of people who are in that queue at the moment to enter Westminster Hall to pay their last respects to Her Majesty the Queen, the hundreds of thousands of others who have done that themselves, perhaps now returned home, will also join in that. So we have cameras in many locations up and down the country to observe the silence. In Downing Street, the Prime Minister will be seen, will be in Blackpool, will be in Northern Ireland, will be in York, and of course will be in central London. Well, there, a minute's silence to observe and mourn the life and legacy of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. And here at Windsor Castle, the crowds gathered, observing the minute's silence, and then, as you can see there, in so many other locations around the country, ripples of applause, 3 cheers in Falkirk. A striking Blackpool Tower there, lit up in red, white and blue, with the heart and the Union flag right in the centre. This is seen at York Minster. And central London, the queues, still many thousands of people waiting their last chance to say their goodbyes to Her Majesty the Queen as she lies in state in Westminster Hall, the queues continuing throughout the night. Well, Becky Johnson is in Derby for us, and Becky, a silence, and then in so many places, cheers, applause. What's been happening there?
Well, this is one community, like so many across the country, that has chosen to come together to mark that National Minute of Silence, to share their thoughts during this period of national mourning, and really to share their reflections. We're now going to hear from a band. This is going to be an evening in celebration of the life and reign of Queen Elizabeth. I can bring in Sally. What have been your reflections just then during that moment of silence, but also during the course of this period of national mourning?
Well, it's a sombre time. We're all sad, I think, and reflecting on, all the past memories, I think. Mum came to the pub in 1953 and she showed the coronation on in the room.
And we're now going to hear songs from the 7 decades or so of the reign of Queen Elizabeth. It's going to be a moment for the community to reflect. And I know you say you've had members of the community who've been to London to join the queue, but also people choosing to remember the Queen in their own quiet way here in Derby.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, a lot of people I think are reflecting on things that are personal to them when they've had moments of meeting her or things like that.
And for yourself, I think many people have perhaps been taken by surprise by how personally emotional they've been.
It is, yeah, it is. I think people have been quite surprised how many have made the journey to London and queued for 24 hours.
All right, thank you so much for talking to us. So yeah, this community will be spending the evening now listening to a concert, taking some quiet time to reflect on the life and reign of Queen Elizabeth II.
Becky Johnson there in Derby. Thank you very much indeed, Becky. Well, I've still got the author and contemporary historian Sir Anthony Selden with me here. And Sir Anthony, just what did you make of that?
Intensely moving, wasn't it? Wherever people were, there's something about silence that brings us all together. Words can so often separate us with our different opinions and shades and ideologies, but in silence, she brought the whole nation, the Commonwealth, many people in the whole world together, recognising our common humanity and remembering somebody whose entire life was dedicated to goodness and to servant leadership, to looking after others, to seeing the best in other people. We've all lost somebody. I thought that was just perhaps as stunning a moment as we've seen.
And then afterwards, we heard it here, didn't we, on the streets of Windsor. The applause, the cheering, it's almost the antidote. It's cathartic, I guess.
Yes, I mean, shades there also of clapping for the NHS and that sense of coming together to support the best, but clearly this will never happen again. This is something that we will never see again in our lifetimes, probably. Certainly never an event like tomorrow, the biggest event, the biggest gathering of great and good and powerful people, perhaps in world history, happening tomorrow. Something very, very special here on the streets of Windsor, wandering around. There's a sense of building and building momentum. I felt the same thing wandering amongst the crowds gathering earlier in the week to walk past the coffin. A sense that this is, time has stopped, that there's a sense of history pausing and something very, very significant is going to be happening.
And is it history setting? Is this the molten lava of history before it turns into igneous rock?
Absolutely. This will, I'm sure, in 50 years' time, people will say this was the end of that Second World War era. Britain as clearly one of the great powers on earth, with its empire extending after the Second World War, its prominence in world history. The question is, where is Britain going to go now? And can Charles lead us there? Will he be allowed to lead us there? Will it just be something for prime ministers? Or perhaps will we see the prime minister and the monarch work in tandem to find a new role for Britain?
Sir Anthony Selden, thank you so much. Well, let's return now to central London, Buckingham Palace. My colleague Anna Botting is there.
Dermot, thank you. And I'm joined by Sky's royal commentator Alistair Bruce and the former Cabinet Minister Lord Boateng. Welcome to both of you. A minute's silence then, Alistair, a coming together for the nation and 3 cheers, as Dermot was mentioning. Much of what we've seen in tribute to the Queen has been thankfulness at her life and gratitude for her service.
Well, from the point where she became Queen, she was well used to going to observe the 2-minute silence every year at the Cenotaph for the soldiers, sailors, airmen and women and others who had laid down their lives in 2 world wars. And she'd watched her grandfather doing it, her father doing it. And I think it's very poignant that today we've done it for her. And it's a big day tomorrow for the nation, the last occasion when the United Kingdom will wrap their former sovereign with all the splendour they can provide. And to start that with this 1-minute silence. And there's wonderful reactions. The great thing, and I think we've seen this throughout the United Kingdom in the last few days, people will react how they want to. And this is catalyst to all sorts of things. We don't always know what it is catalyst for, but in reflection, it certainly has set the tone for tomorrow's dignified and ceremonial events.
A history-making moment this may well be, Lord Boateng. But for someone like you, who first saw the Queen aged 10 in Ghana, what do you think when you watch on and see Britain's place in the world now and what might happen next?
Well, first of all, I mean, I reflect on the late Queen's life and what it meant to so many people, not just in this country, but globally. And there was, I mean, the Anglican Communion, and she's head of the Church of England, the Anglican Communion is a global phenomenon. So you will find in Anglican churches all over the world this sense of loss on the one hand, hope on the other, and this sentiment. I mean, the hush here was almost tangible, wasn't it? And then a spontaneous emotion of appreciation. And we had a similar thing just the Friday after the late Queen passed. My wife and I, like so many others, wanted to lay a floral tribute, and we were just outside the gates of Buckingham Palace here. And we'd put our flowers down, and we happened to do so at the same time as a group of people who we later learned were from something called Christians in Entertainment, and they'd come together because of the Queen's involvement with the Royal Variety shows and the philanthropy for retired and artists. And after they'd laid their flowers and after we'd laid ours, suddenly they began to pray a prayer of thankfulness, and everyone around, including us, just joined in with them. And there was this spontaneity of appreciation and warmth. Now, that's going to linger, but what will follow, I don't think, will be something that will in any sense be negative or backward-looking. People will look to the future of the Commonwealth under a new king, a new generation, and they will look to see Britain in that context. And there will still be this sense of appreciation, this sense that our monarchy has a power to convene that is not matched by any other. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful, and I believe King Charles, when you look at his engagement with the environment, with climate change, with inclusivity, with religious freedom, all those things, these are sentiments that people feel today, and they are relevant.
As we watch those pictures still from Westminster Hall and the queues still outside, whatever does come next, the monarchy could not have had a better platform, if I can put it like that, for what happens with King Charles.
Well, the institution is part of the settled arrangement in the United Kingdom. And when the Queen died, her son became king. We found out he wished to be called Charles. He's now Charles III. We've seen what actually is quite dull, but the procedural processes through which the Constitution at the Accession Council and then in Parliament make so what has naturally happened. And now we are in the process of mourning, which will end on the morning after the funeral tomorrow. So it is a process, but the institution is there because there is a settled view that it should remain there. And it's up to the United Kingdom. We are a democracy, and I think the King is set to support in whatever way he can. And I think watching him and his sister and brothers coming out to pay their respect to their mother has been part of it all, really. It's a sense of focusing. Every one of us, if we're lucky, has had a family or a relation or a friend who we've loved who's died. And people felt they knew the Queen. And through this family, the United Kingdom, as Lord Boateng says, you know, they are a convening power for the United Kingdom, which it's up to our political leadership to decide how to use in a constructive way for us all. That's down to politics.
And the King made it quite clear when he was in Barbados, and my wife and I were there just a few weeks ago, but the King made it clear that he was relaxed and perfectly content with the decision of countries which were previously dominion, which were previously territories, which were previously countries which saw the Queen as head of state, perfectly relaxed about them becoming countries led by presidents, because if that was their choice, fine. And the people of Barbados, although they now have a president rather than a governor-general, still have this sense that the royal family is relevant, that Britain is a part of their history. And yes, that history has had its ups and downs. That history is complex. Life is complex. And we have in Charles III someone who's quite capable of managing that complexity. Of that I've no doubt, and I've seen it in practice when he's been to Brixton, when he's been present in places where, yes, there have been issues around race and equal opportunity, which have been challenging. He has been there bringing people together with practical projects around the Prince's Trust, around his championing of a multi-faith democracy. These are things which he knows and understands, and where he will be able to make a real contribution. I've got no doubt about that.
Lord Boateng, Alistair Rees, thank you both. Well, the Queen Consort has recorded a personal tribute to the late Queen, recalling her wonderful blue eyes and saying, "I will always remember her smile." In the interview, Camilla speaks of how Queen Elizabeth carved out her own role for many years in the difficult position of being a solitary woman in a male-dominated world.
She has been part of our lives forever. I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen being there. It must have been so difficult for her being a solitary woman. There weren't women prime ministers or women presidents. She was the only one, so I think she carved her own role. She made a rule that she had her private time and her private passions and then her public role. And I think that is very important, that, you know, the diary is planned out so you know when you're on duty and when you've got to do things. And then when she went up to Scotland in August, you know, that was the moment where it was her enjoyment. Although she was probably working, you know, with her red boxes throughout, she could have her family to stay, she could do the things she loved. Her real passion was racing. She was able to escape to Sandringham. She had the stud next door. She could go every day, see her foals, work out, you know, the next matings for the year. I think she always kept that as, you know, her private bit. You wouldn't dare question her or argue with her on how a horse had bred or how it ran, because you'd get a very steely, blue-eyed look back again. I remember coming from here, Clarence House, go to Windsor the day I got married, when I probably wasn't firing on all cylinders, quite nervous. And for some unknown reason, I put on a pair of shoes and one had an inch heel and one had a 2-inch hill. So, I mean, it took about hop along, and there's nothing I could do. It's halfway down in the car before I realised. And, you know, she could see it, and she laughed about it and said, look, I'm terribly sorry. And she did, you know, she had a good sense of humour.
Something that is more unusual.
I've taken her to some of my charities and to the Ebony Horse Club and to the medical detection dogs. And she loved both of them. You know, it was real sort of genuine enjoyment, and she asked lots of questions. And it was very nice to take her to things which I knew she would enjoy. She's got those wonderful blue eyes that when she smiles, you know, they light up her whole face. I'll always remember that smile. You know, that smile is unforgettable.
And Alistair, that electric smile we saw in the week that she died, did we not? And we'll always remember that, I think. But how important will the Queen Consort be to King Charles?
Absolutely vital. The King has a very lonely role because, just as the Queen found, you know, you're never in a position where you find your equal. You're always in this elevated position. And everybody needs to be kept in balance when in such an elevated leadership role. And just as Prince Philip used to be brilliant with the Queen and tease her a little and support her and absolutely robustly defend her, so I think the Queen Consort will do exactly that for King Charles. And they've obviously got the most lovely closeness. And I know from my own life, and I'm sure you and anybody else watching from theirs, if you do benefit from that in your life, you're jolly, jolly lucky. And it does keep you centred. And if the role of the King is to provide that deep keel in the stormy seas of time, then he's going to want someone who is his keel too. And clearly the Queen Consort delivers that in spades.
Alistair, thank you. Now then, earlier this afternoon, President Biden was one of those who went to see the Queen as she lay in state at Westminster Abbey. He said afterwards that she communicated dignity and, above all, a notion of service. Well, let's bring in our international affairs editor, Dominic Wycorn. And President Biden, one of more than 500 foreign dignitaries, Dominic, the biggest international event ever to take place in the UK or probably anywhere, who've been at Buckingham Palace this evening.
Yes, and he had words of advice and I think consolation for King Charles. Joe Biden, of course, who's been no stranger to tragedy himself, having lost several members of his family, and he said in these words of advice, publicly he said that the Queen will be with King Charles beside him throughout the remainder of his life. As you say, Joe Biden is one of 100 heads of government being gathered here. I think it's fair to say that there's never been such a concentration of heads of government and royalty and foreign dignitaries before. The closest that comes to it is Nelson Mandela's memorial service back in 2013, where I think more than 50 heads of government. Well, this is going to see double that number gathered for the funeral, amongst them an emperor, sultans, crown princes, grand dukes, and of course presidents. And the big challenge for officials is what do you do with them? How do you get them to Westminster Abbey behind me? The solution to that is to hold them all in a kind of holding pen, if you like, in Chelsea, Royal Chelsea Hospital, and then to bus them here. So that will be a novel experience, I think, for many heads of government. Amongst them will be President Paula May Weeks, who's the president of Trinidad and Tobago, who I interviewed earlier. And she told me how she would feel emotionally during the funeral. And she also talked about how this is the end of an era, but the beginning of a new one. And for the Commonwealth in particular, she says this is an opportunity to bring about change. And she predicted that the process we saw under Queen Elizabeth of countries in the Commonwealth becoming republics, so no longer regarding the British monarch as their head of state, that process, she says, will accelerate.
Your Excellency, looking ahead to tomorrow, the funeral that you'll be attending, what will be your thoughts and memories of the Queen as you sit there in Westminster Abbey through that service?
Well, my most recent memory will be the one when I met her around mid-May as the Trinidad and Tobago Defence Force Steel Band played for her in a private performance, which I attended. And she and I sat together and spoke about the steel ban and a few other things in a short meeting of maybe 15 minutes or so. She was just so gracious, not pretentious at all, so that I perhaps was a little anxious knowing that I was meeting Queen Elizabeth. But the minute she came out and started speaking to me, all the anxiety went, and it was just like meeting an old familiar.
What was her relationship, would you say, with Trinidad and Tobago? How does she regard your country?
Well, she was our head of state until 1976, when we became a republic. And so there were very close ties with the country. When she was there in Shogam, she spoke of her fondness for Trinidad and Tobago and used our national motto, "Together we aspire, together we achieve," as her text for her address then. I think that she held the Trinidad and Tobago as the Caribbean and most, if not all, of the Commonwealth countries in high regard.
And one thing that has been changing, of course, is more and more countries have been following Trinidad and Tobago's lead, going from Commonwealth realms to republics. Is that something that's going to speed up, do you think, now? Is there pressure amongst countries, particularly in the Caribbean, to follow that lead?
Well, a number of Caribbean territories have expressed their inclination to do so. Jamaica, Belize, Antigua and Barbuda, among other Commonwealth nations around the world. There is a feeling now, after all these years, that the sovereign should really be the people, and that to have a sovereign from a country that is far removed, not only geographically but culturally, right, might not necessarily be the best thing at this time of the nation's development. So I think that perhaps the process will begin speeding up in various territories, not particularly because Queen Elizabeth had died, but because that's just the way a lot of the world is moving now.
And what would be your emotions? What will be going through your mind as you sit in the Abbey tomorrow looking back on the era?
That this was bound to come. It's sad because the Queen has died. But things must change. And so this might be a juncture for a small shift, and perhaps one that will gallop on in time. Personally, even though I only met the Queen once, she felt, I wouldn't say an old friend, but because she has always been there and represented to a great extent, even though we are a republic, a certain stability, reliability, a grounding. And that has shifted from under us. The Commonwealth on the whole. On a personal level, I suspect I shall shed a tear or two. I was looking on the television and saw her grandchildren standing vigil around her coffin. And it was so touching, you know. And I thought, well, I really would have to carry my handkerchief with me because it's quite possible that I may shed a tear for the Queen.
The President of Trinidad and Tobago. Well, now, this afternoon, Prince Andrew paid tribute to the Queen. He called her mummy and said, "I will forever hold you close to my heart." On Friday, he was seen again in military uniform as he stood vigil with his siblings over the Queen's coffin at Westminster Hall. Well, I'm joined now by our royal correspondent, Laura Bundock. And Laura, what else did the Duke of York say?
It's an interesting statement for many reasons, I think. It is the last of the Queen's children to make a statement, and he's the only one of them who has used the word mummy, which I think is in itself interesting. And if you look at the photo, I think, that he released accompanying the statement, I think it is the most intimate image we've seen, this picture in black and white taken in 1960 by the Society photographer Cecil Beaton. And you see a Queen there cradling very closely a newborn Andrew. As I say, it could not be a more intimate photo. And let's just have a look at some of the words he said in the statement as well. I'll read you a small section. He said, "Mummy, your love for a son, your compassion, your care, your confidence, I will treasure forever. I have found your knowledge and wisdom infinite, with no boundary or containment. I will miss your insights, advice and humour. As our book of experiences closes, another opens, and I will forever hold you close to my heart with my deepest love and gratitude, and I will tread gladly into the next with you as my guide." Again, such a very personal tribute and a real sense of his personal loss. But let's not forget, we haven't really seen much of the Duke of York. He stepped down from all his royal roles back in 2019, and the Queen stripped him of those honorary military titles after his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. It was only the beginning of this year that he settled out of court the sexual assault case brought against him by Virginia Giuffre. Charges he always denied, but we know there was an undisclosed sum involved, and a very significant sum, and it was exceptional almost to see him wearing military uniform for that special circumstance in the vigil. What can we read into this statement? Well, I think it's certainly perhaps an attempt at maybe looking towards rehabilitation into some kind of royal role. That ultimate decision will rest with the King, and who knows what the future will hold for him.
Laura, many thanks. Laura Bundock, our royal correspondent there. Well, let's listen now to the Queen's first public speech. It was back in 1940, a radio address to the children of the Commonwealth, many of them living away from home, of course, because of the outbreak of the Second World War. And to one of her last appearances as well on television earlier this year during the Platinum Jubilee.
Thousands of you in this country have had to leave your homes and be separated from your fathers and mothers. My sister Margaret Rose and I feel so much for you, as we know from experience what it means to be away from those we love most of all. To you living in new surroundings, we send a message of true sympathy, and at the same time we would like to thank the kind people who have welcomed you to their homes in the country.
Never mind.
Oh dear. Perhaps you would like a marmalade sandwich. I always keep one for emergencies.
So do I. I keep mine in here.
Oh.
For later.
Well, I'm joined now by the author and contemporary historian, Sir Anthony Selden. So, Anthony, I mean, what do we make? About 82 years apart, of course, but what do they tell us about Her Majesty the Queen's evolution?
Well, she's a great actress, isn't she? Had she not had another job, she could have had another career. But it also says, I mean, seriously, it speaks of her deep humanity that we saw even on those that early, was she 14, 15, young teenager, yet she was able to empathise with the experience of many frightened young teenagers and younger than teenagers going out, leaving their homes, worried about what would happen to family left behind. She's identifying with them, and she gives you the feeling that she understands. Highly emotionally intelligent, even at that age, and she's even thanking those people who are hosting those who are coming out of the city centres where there are risks of bombs. And then straight the way forward, she's still got that same ability to speak to people of all ages, children with Paddington, but also, you know, it is a remarkable ability to be able to communicate with and delight and entrance people. I mean, that's a magician over 82 years separating those appearances, performances.
Absolutely astonishing. Sir Anthony Selden, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's return from here at Windsor Castle to Buckingham Palace, and Anna Botting is there, and Anna can tell us, of course, about those huge queues still building to enter Westminster Hall.
Indeed so. In fact, no sign yet that they will close the queue, perhaps letting it peter out. Certainly people once again beginning to queue through the evening, possibly overnight. As you can see, this is Victoria Gardens as it leads into Westminster Hall. This alone has taken some hours for people, but these people will be grateful that they will be allowed to continue to queue. The suggestion had been very early today, in fact, that people should not leave home and not join the back of the queue, which is certainly coming further forward. I understand it's at Tate Modern now as well on the south bank of the river. So certainly the queue seems to be shortening. As I said, no sign they will actually close that queue. And once again, as we've seen, the persistence of people trying to get into Westminster Hall, where a short time ago we saw the French President Emmanuel Macron and his wife Brigitte, the latest of a long line of world leaders who have come to see Her Majesty lying in state. That, of course, ends at 6:30 tomorrow morning. More people, as you can see, coming through. Well, we are on the eve of the first state funeral in more than half a century. It will offer a sense of history and continuity involving traditions and rites that have evolved over generations. The funeral of Queen Elizabeth II will be held at Westminster Abbey, the resting place of monarchs and the traditional site of state funerals for centuries. Ahead of the service, a funeral procession will escort the Queen's coffin to the Abbey from the Houses of Parliament, where it has been lying in state. The coffin, draped with the Royal Standard, will be borne on the state gun carriage of the Royal Navy. The Royal Marines will lead the procession around Parliament Square. Behind, senior members of the royal family, including her children and the King, will be accompanied on the journey to the Abbey by the sound of massed pipes and muffled drums. The procession will enter the Great West Door of Westminster Abbey at exactly 11 o'clock, marking the start of the funeral service. The Queen will be carried past the grave of the unknown warrior and down the nave of the Abbey. Following, as they pass under the ornate gilded entrance to the choir, will be the Archbishop of Canterbury and other senior clergy. And then the coffin, followed by the King and senior members of the royal family, will be taken to the very heart of the Abbey and placed in front of the high altar. Members of the royal family will be seated alongside. Behind them, in the south transept, heads of state, leaders and royalty from around the world. Sitting opposite, holders of the Victoria and George Crosses, their counterparts from the Commonwealth and members of the nation's highest orders of chivalry. While the Prime Minister, former Prime Ministers and the leaders of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland will sit in the Abbey's choir stalls. The Dean of Westminster will lead the service. Lessons will be read by the Prime Minister and the Secretary-General of the Commonwealth. The sermon will be given by the Archbishop of Canterbury. At the end of the service, the last post will be sounded from the Gothic splendour of the Lady Chapel, resting place of kings and queens, including Elizabeth I, going back 700 years. A 2-minute silence will be observed throughout the United Kingdom before the reveille is sounded by trumpeters of the Household Cavalry, and in the Abbey, the national anthem is sung. The final act in the service will be a procession of the Queen's coffin back through the choir and along the nave, out of the Abbey and back onto the state gun carriage before it is taken to Windsor and her final resting place. Well, I'm joined once again by Sky's Royal commentator Alistair Bruce, Rear Admiral Jude Terry from the Royal Navy, and by the former Cabinet Minister Lord Bertin. Welcome back to both of you. Alistair, first of all, let's just reflect that we are blessed with these extraordinary buildings to this way.
Well, Westminster Abbey is profound. It used to be called the parish church of the Empire. It's certainly the parish church of the kingdom. And it does that by containing, first of all, Edward the Confessor's tomb. He was the patron saint of English kingship. and it is filled with former sovereigns and also Mary, Queen of Scots. And it was where the Queen came in 1953 to be crowned. She obviously had got married there too, to Prince Philip. And so I think for the Queen it was a special place. Now, Henry III built it to be that little bit taller than the French coronation church, which was at Reims. And that's why it's so high. It was literally built almost ridiculously to make it just that little bit bigger. And it's designed on a cross so that the central area called the lantern, which is where we will see the Queen placed on a catafalque during her state funeral, is visible by so many more people, which makes it ideal for tomorrow's event. More people can take part.
And it is the traditional place, as you said, for royal weddings and royal funerals. But it's full, isn't it? And at some point they had to go elsewhere, effectively, which is, I guess, what's happened with Windsor.
Yes, during the Hanoverian time, they decided to build a royal vault at Windsor. That too filled. And during the Queen's reign, she built a special place for her father and mother, and it will be there ultimately tomorrow after the state funeral, the service of Committal in St George's Chapel. Tomorrow evening, the royal family will gather and the Queen will be interred with the Duke of Edinburgh, where King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, now lie.
Rear Admiral, let's talk about some of those individuals who will take part tomorrow. Great pride, we've talked already. It's an honour, certainly, for all of them. But there's Royal Naval Ratings, whose job it is to both pull and break the Royal Gun Carriage. I mean, how difficult is that, first of all?
So the gun carriage weighs approximately 300 kilograms on its own. So that is already an enormous weight. The other thing to be aware of is that all the people, the 98 people who will pull the carriage and the 40 people who will be the brake, and the guard officers with them, led by Catherine Jordan, and they only came together last Saturday. And so we have trained them. They have worked really hard to build a team, to understand how they move. And of course, they did that, and we had a rehearsal in Collingwood on Tuesday. But of course, the real test was at the early morning rehearsal, which you covered, as they managed to work with the bands, with the army, with the RAF contingent, with the Commonwealth soldiers and sailors and airmen in order to try and make that better. So they've been practicing on their own. They've built an amazing team. It's incredible to watch. One of the people pulling the state gun carriage, his grandfather pulled the state gun carriage for the previous King's funeral. So those are real history moments. We've also got a number of people who are taking part, and it will be their last act in uniform to be able to say goodbye to the lady we all called the boss. And so they are incredibly privileged. And some of the stories of just watching the pride on their face is immeasurable. And I think, particularly having come for the early morning rehearsal, it really dawned on a lot of them. The eyes of the world are on them, but ultimately for them it's about their own individual pride, the ability for them all to reflect and say thank you, and to do our service, Her Majesty and His Majesty, proud.
So the extraordinary and historic Westminster Abbey, the practice and detail of the military, and then we come to those who are the congregation, including those world leaders. The suggestion is that this will be the biggest congregation of world leaders that human history has ever seen.
Well, it certainly will be one of the biggest with a specific purpose, which is to honour Her late Majesty. That's what's brought them together in this act of spiritual remembrance. And of course, the Abbey has a particular connection with the world of politics. I mean, its juxtaposition physically with Parliament, the links between those who serve as clergy in the Abbey and our fellowship as Christians in Parliament are well known. The Speaker's chaplain, very much part of that group of clergy people within the Abbey. And its symbolism of the Commonwealth too, because that's where the Commonwealth Day service is always held. That was something very dear to Her late Majesty's heart. She was always there. Other members of the royal family always there too, to celebrate and commemorate the Commonwealth. So it will be an event that is, yes, religiously and spiritually symbolic, but also deeply politically relevant as well.
Lord Boateng, Rear Admiral Jude Terry and Alistair Bruce, thank you. I will miss her hugely, the heartfelt words from the Archbishop of Canterbury as he prepares for his role at the Queen's state funeral. Justin Welby also told me that world leaders should learn from Queen Elizabeth's example. He will give the sermon in Westminster Abbey tomorrow in front of a global audience, which could reach billions.
We would all prefer that this had not happened, but it's a huge privilege to be able to take part in this, focused on the family first.
I know you've been down to see the crowds queuing it outside Westminster Hall, for example. You know, is there a shared experience we're having here?
Oh, yes. Yes, yes, yes. I think it is a genuinely shared experience. It's an experience of grief, for many deep grief, but also mixed with an experience of immense thankfulness.
Do you get the sense at all that she's just leaving us at just the wrong moment as we head into this difficult winter, which many people are frightened about?
I think people are very frightened about the future. And for many, we mustn't forget, you know, we've had 10 days of mourning, but that hasn't brought more money into people's pockets. People are still going to food banks during this time, struggling to work out how to make the budget last, make the pay last as long as the month. The extraordinary thing about the royal family is that they know that. And the next few months may be very difficult. Many, many people will be. But from the point of view of the head of state, there's been a seamless transition. There's not going to be a gap there. There will be the hardship, but there's not going to be the gap.
When was the last time you saw her?
It was end of June, early July, and her memory was so acute, her observation so perceptive. You got the benefit of 70 years of accumulated wisdom. Not only her family, but I think every senior politician, every Archbishop will miss her.
You sound like you will, I have to say.
Hugely.
We will watch all these people arriving from around the world on Monday. And there is a sense, even now, that she's unifying the globe in this, don't you think?
Yes. She's going to unite more global leaders, possibly than at any point in human history. And that is perhaps a moment, I hope and pray, that where they will reflect on their own leadership, whatever their faith.
Are you saying that they could learn from her?
Oh, absolutely. I hope they find what they hear and see and think about, a moment where they say to themselves, I would really like people to look on me in the way that they look on her.
We know that she'll be buried alongside her late husband. She'll be reunited with her family, her father, her mother, her sister. We're a tight-knit family. Did she really believe that she would see them again?
Yes. She was a deeply faithful and faith-filled, undemonstrative, quiet Christian who trusted in the faithfulness of God.
Is she at peace now?
Yes.
And should the nation take comfort from that?
I think the nation should take hope from that. Not just comfort, but hope for themselves.
Well, I'm joined by Sky's royal commentator Alistair Bruce and our royal correspondent Rhiannon Mills, and indeed an artist, but we'll come on to that in just a moment. But Rhiannon, first of all, can I just ask you, we've seen so much activity, have we not? Not least at Buckingham Palace behind us, but tomorrow the focus goes back, both to the Queen and to her family who are grieving.
It's amazing seeing all of the crowds camping out already down the Mall, and I couldn't help but think about the fact that it was only, 3 months ago that we were here for the Platinum Jubilee. And again, the Queen in death now is bringing people together. And it's an interesting atmosphere out there. I think there is, and we've seen this all week, I think, there's a sadness, but also a lightness and a sense of tomorrow, yes, for all of the pageantry and the military display and the no doubt very sombre moments that we'll see in the funeral, I think there will be a sense of celebration as well, and I think that will be fascinating to see as the day unfolds. Of course, as you said, we had that enormous gathering of world leaders, probably the biggest diplomatic reception ever held at Buckingham Palace, and of course the King's first. Yeah. But you can't forget that the family were there again around the King. He's had to step up, and I think the whole family are also showing that they are stepping up alongside him as well. He needs their support at the moment. Getting the tone right was always going to be really difficult in this moment. We've had more tributes today, the likes of Prince Andrew saying he will always remember the Queen's love of a son. Of course, he's had his difficult times. Also, the new Queen Consort as well, reflecting on the Queen's sense of humour, how much she loved Balmoral, so a poignancy that she passed away there. And tomorrow we will see again the family very much front and centre of the proceedings and the funeral. And I think, again, reflect back on what a difficult week it has been for them, despite the fact that they have wanted to share their moment of grief so publicly.
Rhiannon, thank you very much indeed. And once again, we see those people paying tribute, taking a moment, a bow perhaps, in this extraordinary atmosphere we've seen in Westminster Hall. But let's bring in now Ralph Hymans, a portrait painter who had the honour, if I can say that, of painting the Queen's diamond, correct me if I'm wrong, Jubilee official portrait. How did it come about, first of all?
Originally through the Australian High Commission. A proposal was put forward, and 10 months later, we had a yes. So it was extraordinary. So it turned out that it was the only portrait she sat for during her Diamond Jubilee, so it became the Diamond Jubilee portrait, which was a remarkable opportunity.
Well, there it is, and there you are by it. And it is huge, it has to be said.
It is. It's 9 by 11 feet. I think it's the largest official portrait of the Queen. But that was really for expressive purposes to show her amongst the vastness of the Abbey, to represent her singular existence, really. The burden of office that she must have, had, and a reminder of where she was physically crowned 60 years earlier.
And Alistair, you had something to do with Ralph's choice of where he should cite the Queen in this portrait.
Well, Ralph and I had quite a chat, didn't we?
We did, yes.
And I've always loved the idea of the place of coronation where it all began.
Yes.
And of course, it's very ironic that it's there again in Westminster Abbey tomorrow, where we will all have our eyes. But for you, taking on that building...
It was remarkable, but I think our conversation, where you described some of the deep historical significance of the Abbey and the Cosmati pavement on the high altar, which is where the coronation takes place, and in particular the sacred geometry of that extraordinary 13th century mosaic, and by drawing my attention to that, it was a real inspiration for the portrait.
But Ralph was marvellous because he knew exactly how to capture her reflecting. And the point of the painting is, if I get this right, that she's reflecting upon the past, the present, and in those days, the future. And of course, in a sense, we now know the end of the story.
Yes.
But there's still a profound nature to the close-up of the painting, as well as there is from a distance.
That's right. It was very important that, for me, that there was a sort of very reflective tone in this portrait. And so getting that particular pose was quite a challenge during the sitting, and I asked Alistair to accompany me at the sitting, which was very helpful. And so Alistair...
Well, you wanted the Queen to look down, so we decided that I would sit cross-legged on the floor and talk to the Queen. And I remember the conversation was about my 6th great-grandmother, who was a convict, who went over to Australia. She stole a horse, and they thought she was a man. And then they discovered she was a woman. And the Queen was fascinated by the story. In fact, I brought out of my pocket a $20 Australian bill because my 6th great-grandmother is on it. She was called Mary Raby, and she was the first businesswoman in Australia. So the Queen is actually, if you look at the painting, almost perplexed to hear this story. But it was a very lovely moment, wasn't it?
It was. It was very lovely, and it was... During the sitting, I think it was, I had, because she sat in Buckingham Palace, we had to sort of paint a visual picture and spoke about the gravity of the moment where she would be standing on the Cosmati pavement to set the tone and the mood for the sitting. So it was remarkable.
And tell us something about the clothes that she is wearing, because she was closely involved, and there was a lot of discussion, was there not, with the palace about what she would actually wear for this portrait?
Exactly. So there were some requests put forward originally for the coronation robe, which I don't believe she's worn since the day of coronation. And we had a response back from the palace saying she'd like to think about the robe overnight and discuss it with Prince Philip, which I thought was absolutely lovely. And it was decided that she would wear the robe of state, the parliamentary robe that she also wore when she entered the Abbey on the day of her coronation. So it was very relevant, and it was remarkable. So she was dressed as she is in the painting during the sitting, which was extraordinary.
And I think you had to go and collect her, did you not?
I was taken by the courtier to go and collect the Queen, and she came out sort of slightly holding up her dress with the robe hanging off her shoulders, very heavy, carried by one of her pages, who we will see tomorrow in the funeral procession. And when she saw me, she said, never left her, but it was a very moving, and you worked so quickly, Rolf.
Yes, I think we even finished a little early, and I think she said that that by finishing 10 minutes early, she had a little bit more time to walk the corgis, which she hadn't had a chance to do for a while during the Diamond Jubilee, because she was so busy.
Well, wonderful recollections from both of you, really, really extraordinary. But, you know, that is it, isn't it? The Queen is perhaps the most painted person in the world, photographed too. And we see the scene there at Buckingham Palace, the lights on, the royal family waiting for what will no doubt be a very difficult and testing day for them tomorrow, Rhiannon.
We've already seen them, haven't we, over the days since the Queen died, wanting to publicly share this moment of grief. We had vigils. I was inside Westminster Hall last night when we saw the grandchildren's vigil. I was commentating on radio, and the intense silence in the hall is one thing, but then I think for those who were walking past the grandchildren, it did heighten that sense of emotion. And I think in a way we will see that again tomorrow, because again for the family, it's really important that just as they did in life, they are again going to be there seen supporting the Queen in death. They will be there behind the coffin once again, as we've seen them carrying out that procession so many times already, and accompanying her to Westminster Abbey, a place where they've spent happy times together, where they've had celebrations together. And in that moment, I think coming together, yes, with all of those world leaders, but also I think importantly, reflecting on the sense of service and duty that the Queen passed on to the nation. And you're going to see that in the fact that you'll have NHS workers in the procession. You're going to have members of her charities within the congregation. And just as she did for her Platinum Jubilee, that milestone, yes, we were all talking about her and what a remarkable reign she'd had. But no, for her, it was about making sure that communities were coming together, especially after the pandemic, celebrating the ways that people had come together in the last couple of years during those difficult moments. And we're going to see that, I think, tomorrow in the service. So yes, for all of the enormity of it, the fact that this is going to be such a spectacle, the military pageantry of a state funeral that we have never probably seen in our lifetimes. And the world will be watching, all of those world leaders there, but ultimately a family at the centre paying tribute to her service and duty.
Rhiannon Mills, Ralph Hymans and Alistair Bruce, thank you very much indeed. Well, they are still queuing, as you might imagine, the final hours of lying in state. Still, the atmosphere in there with respect. Let's leave you now with some of the sounds and images of the past 24 hours.
It has pleased Almighty God to call to his mercy our late Sovereign Lady, Queen Elizabeth II, of blessed and glorious memory, by whose decease the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is solely and rightfully come to the Prince Charles Philip Arthur George. 3 cheers for His Majesty the King. Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray!
Wherever you may live in the United Kingdom, or in the realms and territories across the world, and whatever may be your background or beliefs, I shall endeavor to serve you with loyalty, respect, and love, as I have throughout my life.
Her Majesty gave us 70 years. What's giving her 9 hours? That's nothing.
I'd worked 21 hours for her. When I was very little, me and my mum said we would come to this. My mum's passed away, so I'm here for her.
Have you been waiting long, David?
A little while.
There is a motto which has been borne by many of my ancestors, a noble motto, I serve. Those words were an inspiration to many bygone heirs to the throne when they made their knightly dedication as they came to manhood. I cannot quite do as they did, but through the inventions of science, I can do what was not possible for any of them. I can make my solemn act of dedication with the whole empire listening. I should like to make that dedication now. It is very simple. I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
From the young Elizabeth